heard that a prisoner was killed by guards in another prison, everybody felt like if they did it to this guy, they can do it to anybody.
On September 9th, 1971, chaos erupted in Attica when inmates took control, holding 42 staff members hostage. After months of tension and negotiations being stalled, state troopers finally stormed in using tear gas and live rounds to regain control. And just like Attica Correctional Center, here are prisons only meant for serial killers. July 28, 2024, at approximately 1:29 p.m., 21-year-old Sean Jackson Jr. was brutally murdered by another inmate, Jarvis Richardson, exposing the flaws in California State Prison. In 1988, California State Prison Corcoran CSP opened its gates in King County, emerging as the solution to the severe overcrowding in California prison systems. Designed as a maximum security facility, it became home to some of the nation's most dangerous inmates, most notorious serial killers, and those with extreme behavioral issues. Over time, Corcoran's walls witnessed the incarceration of high-profile criminals, cementing its reputation as one of the most notorious prisons in the country. Corcoran has gained repute for its intense violence, though pinpointing exact figures is challenging. Countless inmate-on-inmate assaults have been recorded, and the prison has faced repeated accusations of excessive force by guards. At one point, rumors swirled about gladiator fights, with allegations that the guards were behind it all. The prison's huge inmate population, combined with its harsh disciplinary measures and violent past, has solidified Corcoran's status as one of the most dangerous facilities in the nation. Known for housing individuals who pose significant risks to both fellow inmates and staff. Talking about this place without mentioning notorious inmates like Juan Corona is impossible. A Mexican-born farm labor contractor, Corona became one of California's most infamous serial killers. Back in the early 70s, he was convicted for the brutal murders of 25 migrant farm workers in the Yuba City area. The victims were discovered in shallow graves, many bearing the marks of violent death, stab wounds, blunt force trauma, and other signs of horrific violence. Now, his case remains one of the most chilling in the state's history. Corona was well known in the migrant community for hiring men to work in the fields, which made him a familiar figure. Investigators eventually linked him to the murders when receipts from his business were discovered at some of the grave sites. In 1971, he was convicted and sentenced to 25 consecutive life terms. However, his conviction was overturned in 1978 due to inadequate legal representation. After a retrial in 1982, he was found guilty yet again, although he didn't confess to the murders. He did pass away in 2019 at the age of 85 while still in prison. Then there's Edmund Kemper, the infamous co-ed killer, who took the lives of 10 people, including his own mother. Despite the brutality of his crimes, Kemper had developed a reputation as a model prisoner during his time at Corcoran, and even earned a level of respect from both staff and inmates. Kemper had been involved in voluntary programs like narrating audiobooks for the blind, really showing a calm demeanor that contrasted with the violent behavior of many other high-profile inmates. And with that, he would avoid harsh disciplinary measures common in Corcoran, such as solitary confinement or even physical restraint. But despite the seemingly lighter treatment compared to other violent criminals, Kemper remains in max security with no possibility of release, a reflection of the horrific nature of his crimes.
A corrections officer at the Attica prison is recovering after being stabbed in the hand. The Union for Corrections Officers says it happened last Friday during a fight in the mess hall.
September 9th, 1971. There was chaos inside Attica. Inmates had taken over the prison, holding 42 prison staff hostage. Tensions ran high as negotiations dragged on for months, and it took a shocking turn when state troopers stormed in, using tear gas and live rounds to regain control. By September 13th, what started as a protest had turned into one of the bloodiest prison uprisings in U.S. history, with 43 people dead, including 10 correctional officers, 33 inmates, and over 80 others wounded. This sparked a harsh light on the deep issues within the U.S. prison system, responding to demands for better treatment and reforms. Attica Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison built in the 1930s, is run by the state's Department of Corrections and is infamous for housing dangerous criminals, which included serial killers and those with severe psychological issues. The environment inside had this reputation for being brutal, with extreme violence and mental stress being common. Despite its high security, though, Attica's dark history and tense atmosphere make it one of the most infamous prisons in the U.S. You see, to maintain control, strict measures are put in place. One of these is the use of tear gas, which get deployed in areas like the mess hall and industry sections to break fights. Inmates can be placed in solitary confinement or the box, where they're isolated for up to 23 hours a day. The prison would use physical restraints, and inmates can face restrictions on things like visitation or communication with the outside world. One of Attica's most notorious inmates was serial killer David Berkowitz, the infamous son of Sam. Now, Berkowitz spent most of his time in prison without causing major trouble, but the tough disciplinary measures were always looming, especially for inmates with violent pasts like his. David Berkowitz was a notable inmate who terrorized New York City by committing a series of shootings, leaving 6 people dead and 7 others wounded between 1976 and 77. His victims were often young couples sitting in parked cars. And what made Berkowitz even more notorious was his habit of taunting the police and the media. He left bizarre letters at the crime scenes, signed with the chilling pseudonym Son of Sam. The letters, along with the randomness of his attacks, created widespread fear throughout the city. Berkowitz was eventually captured in August 1977, after a parking ticket led police to his car and linked him to the shootings. He confessed to every murder, claiming that a demon, supposedly speaking through his neighbor's dog, had commanded him to kill. He was given 6 consecutive life terms in prison. Over the years, you can see him as remorseful, even turning to religion, but he'll remain behind bars for the rest of his life. The United States Penitentiary USP in Leavenworth, Kansas, is known to have a unique history, having been established through a special act of Congress. Back in 1897, the War Department transferred the land to the Justice Department to build the prison. One key reason for selecting this location was the labor available from the U.S. disciplinary barracks at nearby Fort Leavenworth. In fact, these people helped with the initial phase of construction and were the first prisoners housed at the penitentiary in 1903. Now, the first cell block opened in 1906, and the entire facility was completed by the mid-1920s. At its peak, it was the largest max security prison in the U.S. until 2005, when it was downgraded to medium security, now holding about 1,670 inmates. The prison is surrounded by imposing 40-foot-high walls, which extend 40 feet below ground and stretch for over 3,000 feet, enclosing nearly 23 acres. Now, you can see this impressive structure from a distance, and it remains a notable landmark visible from across the street on the south side of Metropolitan. A notable inmate here is one virtually everybody knows in the person of Jeffrey Dahmer, often referred to as the Milwaukee Cannibal. This American serial killer and sex offender, notorious for his horrific crimes committed between 1978 and 91, would lure his victims to his apartment, mostly men and boys, which he drugged, sexually assaulted, and eventually killed. His crimes escalated into necrophilia and cannibalism, leaving the nation horrified. However, in 1991, he got arrested when one of his victims managed to escape and led the police back to his apartment. They found the most sick you guys ever seen in your lives, including photographs of dismembered bodies and human remains. By 1992, he was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms in prison for his murders. However, his life behind bars ended tragically when he was murdered by a fellow inmate in 1994. His story remains one of the most chilling in true crime history.
After 5 years of negotiation, and for the very first time, the hospital has allowed cameras in to meet the men who live behind these walls.
Although not technically a prison, Broadmoor is a high-security psychiatric hospital in the UK that does house some of the most dangerous and violent criminals, many of whom suffer from severe mental disorder. While its primary focus is psychiatric treatment, Broadmoor's security facilities' high walls and infamous reputation often lead the public to assume it functions like a prison. While in reality, the hospital's layout and daily routines are designed to support therapeutic treatment rather than serve purely as confinement. Broadmoor was established in 1863 in response to the growing need for secure treatment facilities for individuals with mental disorders who had committed serious crimes. You see, in the 19th century, there was this increasing awareness of the link between mental illness and criminal behavior, and those existing institutions weren't well equipped to handle the specific needs of this kind of population. Now, this place was known as the Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum, and it was built to provide a secure environment for patients while addressing their mental health needs. It was designed to balance safety with a therapeutic approach, reflecting the idea that treatment, more than just punishment, could help individuals with these mental illnesses. Over the years, Broadmoor has evolved into a high-security psychiatric hospital, focusing on patient care while ensuring their staff and public safety. Now, it's not a traditional prison, but most of Broadmoor's patients come through the criminal justice system, reflecting the institution's dual focus on both mental health and criminal behavior. Most of its staff are members of the Prison Officers Association, and these measures are to ensure that security remains a top priority. One of such people housed here is Peter Sutcliffe, also known as the Yorkshire Ripper. He terrorized northern England in the late 1970s and early 80s with his brutal attacks on women. One of the largest manhunts in British history was linked to Sutcliffe, who primarily targeted prostitutes but also attacked women in residential neighborhoods. He would often lure them to isolated areas where he would brutally assault and kill them. And you can just imagine the shockwave the nation felt. Despite numerous investigations, police had struggled to catch him, partly due to misleading information and hoax letters. Sutcliffe was finally arrested in January 1981 on unrelated charges and did confess to the murders, claiming that he was following orders from God. Convicted of 13 murders and 7 attempted murders, Sutcliffe was given life in prison, ensuring that he would never be released. His crimes exposed flaws in police investigations and highlighted the dangers women, especially workers, faced during that time. Another inmate housed at this place was Robert Maudsley, dubbed Hannibal the Cannibal. Born in 1953 in Liverpool, Robert would be the 4th child of a lorry driver. By the time he was 2, Robert and his siblings were placed in care due to severe parental neglect. He would get pretty violent later in life, earning him the nickname Blue, after his first victim's face turned blue during strangulation. Later on, he became known as Spoons, after killing another victim and leaving a spoon embedded in the skull, with part of the brain missing. And his 3rd and 4th murder occurred on the same afternoon, leading to his infamous nickname, Hannibal the Cannibal. You see, although Maudsley hasn't committed a crime in over 25 years, he does remain classified as Britain's most dangerous prisoner. He's pretty much spent his time in near total isolation, and with no chance of release, he's expected to remain in there for the rest of his life. Sing Sing Prison came on board in 1826 to alleviate overcrowding and issues in New York's earlier prison, Newgate in Auburn. Elam Linz, the warden of Auburn Prison, was tasked with overseeing the project, and impressively, the facility was built by inmate labor. Its location along the Hudson River made it convenient for transporting materials by boat. And right from the very beginning, Sing Sing became known for strict discipline and harsh conditions. Built for the state's most dangerous criminals, Sing Sing became known for its frequent use of the electric chair for execution. Now before that, harsh punishments like whippings with cat-o'-nine tails were common until they were banned in 1848. Under Linz, inmates weren't even allowed to speak. This place conducted nearly all of New York's executions after the introduction of that electric chair in 1891, until that practice was moved to Greenhaven in 1963. But despite its brutal past, Sing Sing has become a site for reformation. Warden Thomas Mott Osborne introduced significant changes after serving time as an inmate. and Lewis Edward Laws, who led from 1920 to 1941, improved conditions and added recreational programs. Although as infamous as Sing Sing has always been, it always helped shape broader prison reforms. One of the most infamous and twisted killers ever held at this prison was Albert Fish, known for his gruesome crimes and cannibalistic tendencies. Born on May 19, 1870, Fish had committed at least 3 child murders between 1924 and 28. This guy had eerie nicknames like the Gray Man, the Brooklyn Vampire, and the Boogeyman. Though a suspect in more than 10 murders, he confessed to only 3, along with the stabbing of 2 others. Fish once said to have harmed over 100 children, but no one knows if that's really true. He was arrested in 1934 for the murder of Grace Budd and was executed by that electric chair in 1936.
With 1,500 inmates, incorrigibles sent here from California's other prisons to isolate them. And they do hard time here in the SHU. Time here is like hard time in no other prison.
Pelican Bay State Prison, PBSP, is a supermax prison made for the worst criminals in California. I mean, the worst of the worst. And half of this prison is for max security inmates. And the first half is level 4, which is a general population setting, while the other half is called the Security Housing Unit, or SHU, meant for inmates presenting serious management concerns. So Pelican Bay State Prison opened in 1989, and it was built to handle California's most dangerous criminals and gang members. With the violence rising in other prisons, the state needed a place designed for max security and control. Located just 13 miles from the Oregon-California border and north of Crescent City, Pelican Bay focuses on isolating the most violent offenders to ensure the safety of both staff and its inmates. A DOJ report shows Pelican Bay's most extreme isolation practices. Inmates often spend 22 to 24 hours a day in a small windowless cell with very limited human contact. The DOJ raised concerns about the severe psychological toll it takes, increasing the risk of mental illness. Human rights groups like Watch and Amnesty International condemned the SHU, describing it as inhumane and akin to torture, given its impact on mental health and extreme isolation. One special inmate here would be the horrific Charles Manson, an infamous cult leader and serial killer convicted back in 1971 for orchestrating 7 murders over 2 nights in 1969, which included the notorious Tate LaBianca killings. Manson led the Manson family, a California-based cult primarily composed of women treated as servants to engage in unconventional practices. And by July 1969, Manson had shot Bernard Crowe and later directed his followers to commit multiple murders. He had died of cancer-related complications in 2017 while serving a life sentence. Another notable inmate here would be Mark William Cunningham, a serial killer who brutally killed 3 guys in 1983. His victims, all men in their 20s, were found in different locations across the U.S. He would befriend his victims before luring them into a vulnerable situation where he would then kill them. After the shock, a nationwide manhunt was launched, and he was eventually caught, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison.
Inmates get yard time for just a couple of hours twice a week. Other than showers and meal times, these are their only moments outside their cells, a chance to socialize and make allies.
Founded in 1852, San Quentin Rehabilitation Center, or SQ, is California's oldest prison. Located just north of San Francisco in Marin County, it's best known for housing the state's male death row inmates, including notorious serial killers. It is known to have the largest number of death row inmates in the country, along with a high-security execution chamber. Now, San Quentin was built during the gold rush when California's booming population led to an increase in crime, requiring a facility tough enough to handle some dangerous offenders. The strict design helped manage a large, unruly prison population, making it one of the most formidable prisons in the U.S. Now, San Quentin has been stamped into pop culture, featured in movies, books, TV shows, and even concerts. We had Johnny Cash famously performing there in 1969, followed by former inmate Merle Haggard in 1971, cementing that cultural status. The prison appeared on the TV series Lockup, offering a look inside the four walls. Life on death row takes a very heavy toll on its inmates, many of whom struggle with mental health issues due to long-term isolation and just the weight of their crimes. But despite its dark history, San Quentin remains one of the most recognizable prisons in America, known for its connection to both crime and pop culture. A well-known inmate here was Richard Ramirez, dubbed the Night Stalker, who became famous for his violent killing spree in California between 1984 and 85. This guy was known to have killed at least 13 people, often breaking into homes and actually killing many of his victims. Raised by Mexican immigrant parents, Ramirez was exposed to violence at a young age, even witnessing his cousin kill his wife. So after dropping out of high school, he moved to LA and began the life that led him down the drain. In 1989, he was convicted and sentenced to death for those horrific actions, but he died of cancer in 2013, never really expressing any remorse. Another popular inmate who spent time here was William Bonin, also known as the Freeway Killer. A twice-paroled offender, Bonin brutally killed at least 21 boys and men in Southern California between 1979 and 80. He's also suspected of being responsible for 15 more murders, but many of his victims were found along the freeways, which led to that chilling nickname, one he shares with two other serial killers. Prosecutors labeled him the most arch-evil person who ever existed, but he was eventually convicted of 14 murders and spent 14 years on death row before being executed by lethal injection in 1996.
Inmates spend an average of 23 hours a day in a 7 by 12-foot concrete cell.
It has famously been called a cleaner version of hell, and it's where Joe Harsonayev would go if the jury decided to spare his life.
Welcome to ADX Florence, or the Florence Supermax, a federal prison in Florence, Colorado, designed to house the most dangerous inmates in the U.S. This place was opened back in 1994, operating under some extreme security measures, with inmates held in solitary confinement for up to 23 hours a day in small, soundproof cells. Known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, this facility was created to handle inmates considered too violent or disruptive for other facilities, and for individuals deemed a severe threat to society and other inmates. So as part of a federal correctional complex in Colorado, ADX Florence was created after a series of violent incidents in other federal prisons, including the murder of correctional officers. Norman Carlson, former director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, pushed for this high-security facility to manage these dangerous inmates. He modeled it after the USP Marion, which had been in permanent lockdown for 23 years. ADX Florence houses the most dangerous criminals, which include those whose escape would threaten national security. One notorious serial killer who does require the highest level of control and isolation has to be Michael J. Swango, a former American doctor and admitted serial killer. You see, in the 80s and 90s, he used his position to poison patients and even colleagues, which started while he was in medical school. After graduating from Southern Illinois University School of Medicine, he began his deadly activities during an internship at Ohio State University Medical Center. Swango's believed to be responsible for up to 60 deaths, though he only admitted to 4. He poisoned his patients with arsenic or overdosed them on medication, and in 2000, he pled guilty to avoid the death penalty and received 3 life sentences. Another notable inmate of ADX Florence has to be Theodore J. Kaczynski. During the late 70s and mid-90s, this guy planted homemade bombs at universities and several other locations, even sometimes sending them to people's homes, leading to the deaths of 3 people and injuring 23 others. Eventually, Teddy was arrested by feds in 1996. 2 years later, he pled guilty to the bombings and received a life sentence without the chance of release. He claimed that his violent acts were aimed at causing the downfall of modern society. And then we have Joseph E. Duncan III, a convicted American serial killer and currently on death row. He's serving 11 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. For Duncan, we have to go back to 1980, when he was given 20 years for sexually assaulting a boy. And in 2005, he ran from charges in Minnesota, where he kidnapped Shasta and Dylan Groen after brutally murdering their family in Idaho. Shasta was eventually rescued, but sadly, Dylan didn't survive. And for these horrific crimes, Duncan received multiple life and death sentences. And in 2008, after being sentenced to death, he was transferred to ADX Florence in Colorado.